All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. All right, I want to welcome the members of this tax reform study committee. Honored to have all of you here again this morning. By way of just a moment of introduction, and we have state has suffered a devastating loss to its agricultural economy, also in life and damage to citizens' properties in southwest Georgia. And that goes without saying. We've also seen our sister states, Florida, suffering at the hands of Michael, also South Carolina, North Carolina, and Florence earlier this year. With that said, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like a moment of silence, and I'd like to say a few words of prayer for those communities. That would be all right with me. And members, if you would bow your heads. Heavenly Father, come before you today with humility, and the sounds of suffering for our brothers and sisters in Southwest Georgia, Panhandle of Florida, and also remembering those families and individuals whom have suffered tragedy, loss, and damage as a result of hurricanes. We pray for their well-being, and we also pray for volunteers, first responders, those that are providing hope and support to those communities. Be with them, protect them, do their jobs to the best of their ability, and help all of us to lend a helping hand and support for all of these families that have suffered during this time. Amen. The other aspect I'd like to ask, just as part of the administrative process. Announced a special called session of the General Assembly to begin on Tuesday, November 13th this year. The discussion will be amending our fiscal year 2019 budget to allocate recovery efforts following Hurricane Michael, and also a couple of other items that I think that he's called for that deal with it appears we will begin on Tuesday, November 13th, and operate until at least Friday, November 16th. So with that, I just want to make sure that was clear to everyone. And Chairman Powell has contacted me this morning to request that the committee consider meetings during session. So as we are meeting, we'll try to schedule some of the committee meetings, probably the last two meetings of this committee during that week. If that is workable for the committee members, if it is not workable for the majority of the committee members, and I know Mr. Powers, you have Powers, Chatham County, so we'll bear that in mind. So we'll as you look at your calendar, please let me know if there are any of those days not workable for you. But that would be the desires of Chairman Powell. Like to have some of the committee meetings during that session that will allow for more people to participate. So I'll just raise that for you to consider, and then we will discuss that further in subsequent emails. Try to communicate that and shore up today. In addition, the committee should be aware that you received an email from Ms. Lewis, my administrative assistant, and possibly from also Brian Groom, that properties. You also received a summary of appeal process under OCGA 48-5-311, and then a presentation from ACCG. call on Commissioner Lynn Riley to introduce her staff that have been so kind to prepare and join us today and give us that overview. And Brian is reminding me that all these documents are online on our website. Brian, you want to give them the website and address?
So if you go to the House website, the top committees take you there, and then special and study committees off to the side. And then over to reforming real property. And all of our materials are going to be posted on this website, and they won't come down at any certain time, so they should be up there whenever you want to see them. And this is everything that we printed off for the members to see.
Good. Thank you, Brian. Thank you for the support staff for that. Appreciate that very much. Thank you for showing. With that, Commissioner Riley.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, members of the committee and folks in the audience today. Pleasure to be with you today, and I apologize again for not being here at your first gathering. And I hope you'll forgive me. I was welcoming a grandson. Is a delight. So thank you for excusing my attendance during that meeting. Delighted to be here with the Department of Revenue today to provide an overview of the property valuation process. Ellen Mills, as the chairman mentioned, is our Director of Local Government Services. She will be presenting. We will focus primarily on pages 1 through 8 of the PowerPoint presentation. Additional information is also included in the presentation. The presentation speaks to the appeals process, which we will, I believe, be considering in a subsequent meeting. Government Services in 2014. She is a level 4 appraiser and served as chief appraiser in Fayette County. We also have with us from the department today Mr. Grant Hilton, who will be doing some presentations on our appraisal system. Mr. Don Hicks is also with us this morning, a member of the Local Government Services Division. And also from the department, Brian Walker, our Director of Legislative Affairs, and Stephen Devon, our Manager in Legal Affairs and Tax Policy of Specialized Taxes. So with that, if I could introduce Ellen Mills to walk us through the Georgia Department of Revenue presentation. Thank you, Ellen.
Thank you, Ellen.
This is a short PowerPoint, and
Let me ask a question. Do we have
Yeah,
let's see if we can get a mic that'll work for you.
You want to sit at the...
No, could you want to sit at the edge there? Ms. Mills, can you sit right at the edge that I can put any of these mics on, whichever's that's probably the most convenient one for you. So I'm going to put that one on.
She can see.
All right. Can you see? Will you be able to see the? Okay.
can you see?
I can. Yeah, let me just slide that mic up a little bit closer. Thanks, Brian. Good.
Okay, can you hear me? So, yeah, this is not going to work. I'll just look at the PowerPoint. So property tax is a big tax. It's about $10 billion a year. It's pretty equal to income tax and sales tax. So I just showed you this little pie chart to get a realization of how big it is. It's a big deal to the local governments. It's a major funding tool for the local governments. The entities, so I've broken this down into a few different sections. The entities involved, the primary phases of property tax, the appraisal process, which we're going to talk about today, taxpayer appeals, digest review, and training, which we'll talk about in another time. So the entities involved in ad valorem taxation, at the county level, at the local level, you've got the levying authorities and recommending authorities. The boards of assessors are about 745 members of boards of assessors. Appraisers, we count 1,076 active appraisers in our training program. We estimated support staff. We don't have to train the support staff, but through an estimation in our training program, we see about 200. Tax commissioners, there are 159, of course. Each county has a tax commissioner, and deputy tax commissioners and staff would add about a few hundred more to their organization. Appeal administrator, 159 clerks of Superior Court. And then coordinators, boards of equalization members, hearing officers. So I've just basically given you a count of the number of people locally that are working on property tax administration at some level. All told, it's about 5,000, but if we just want to focus on the appraisal part of it, about 3,000 people working on appraisal and working through appeals. On the state side, the Revenue Department has about 25 people that are dedicated to property tax, and the Department of Audits has 18. Of course, there are 159 counties in Georgia, and that's always a fun slide. We save that one a lot because we're second in the nation for number of counties. The phases of ad valorem tax administration. We're going to start with the appraisal process and the appeal process. Then there's the millage rate adoption, compiling the digest and millage rate adoption, billing, collection, and distribution of taxes that the tax commissioner would perform, and then the state agencies would do the digest review, investigations, and audits, and then also required publications as part of the phases. So appraisal, assessment, and appeal. The Board of Assessors have to appraise and assess that property, all property, every year. About 4.4 million pieces of real estate, and I don't know the number of personal property accounts, but quite a bit. They have to send notices of assessment when they make changes to personal property accounts, and they send notice of assessments every year on real property. They have to process taxpayers' appeals. Usually, in most counties, it's less than 1% of the properties are under appeal. And then forward that by July 15th to the tax commissioner for digest compiling. The appeal administrator oversees the appeal process, and the Department of Revenue promulgates regulations, training. We do the WINGAP technical support, which is their appraisal system, and public utility appraisal. I'm going to skip over these other slides because they really pertain to things past the appraisal process, and you can view those at your leisure. So getting into the appraisal process. It's pretty much the same for all kinds of appraisals, whether it's a single property appraisal or mass appraisal. The first step is to define the problem. In mass appraisal, that's identify what's being appraised, identify what the definition of fair market value is. We have several different definitions of fair market value, one for normal, real, and personal property, one for historic, brownfield, landmark, historic. So there are different definitions of value, different definition for motor vehicle than for real and personal property. So you have to define the value and define the effective date of the appraisal. Then the planning phase, which is determining what the scope of work would be, to determine what resources are needed and how long it's going to take you to get that work done. In the third step, collecting data and analyzing that data, the tax assessor collects an unbelievable amount of data and maintains a history of an enormous amount of data from zoning, deeds, plats, measuring houses, determining acreage amounts, where power line easements are, or any type of information that would be useful in determining what the fair market value of a property is, and the assessor is compiling that constantly year-round. The next step would be application of the data. So the assessor has to determine what the comparative units are per square foot, per acre, per front foot. These are comparative units that they're going to use to build a table, a mathematical model in their appraisal software that they can then apply to the specific characteristics of each property to arrive at a fair market value and allow for statistical testing as well. The reconciliation portion is basically the testing portion, testing that and calibrating that math model to ensure that it actually came up to the proper value of the property. The CAMA system has to allow for factors to be applied to individual properties, because individual properties are going to be uniquely situated where they may have problems or desirable things about them that would cause their value to be higher or lower than the benchmark. And then the assessor has to report that value, and that's usually done with a notice of assessment or a property record card. The Georgia assessor is going to adhere to IAAO standards. The International Association of Assessing Officials was founded in 1934, and it produces technical standards on how to do mass appraisal. And it's widely known and used throughout the United States as a benchmark for best practices in assessment or appraisal for mass appraisal. USPAP is required. It was the Appraisal Foundation was authorized by the Congress in 1989, and it produces standards for all types of appraisals, including mass appraisal. And the assessor should adhere to USPAP to the extent that they can. It's required that they adhere to that for federally related loans. And the Appraisal Procedure Manual was developed by the Department of Revenue in the 1999, to provide local Georgia tax officials with the rules and regs and the steps to arrive at fair market value. And so that's kind of their guidebooks. There are 3 guidebooks on how to get their job done and the standards to which they have to adhere. The Appraisal Procedure Manual is designed to come up with a basic opinion of value. But if a property has any kind of specific circumstances, the appraiser has to consider those specific circumstances. Terrible water problem, you know, someone might need additional depreciation on their property if it constantly floods, or just things that are specific to the property the assessor has to think about. The Board of Assessors are required by this regulation to have their staff use the Appraisal Procedure Manual. They can't color outside the lines. And then again, the assessors should consider USPAP and IAAO standards to the extent that they don't conflict with Georgia law. There's a few words that are very specific to tax assessment. CAMA, that's the computer assisted mass appraisal software. That's the big math model that they're going to dump all their research into, and all the specific data about all the various properties, and build a math model that will develop into the fair market value of properties. Equalization is the process for ensuring that all property is uniformly assessed. Mass appraisal is the systematic appraisal of groups of properties, which allows for statistical testing. And property classification is kind of one of the first steps in mass appraisal, is identifying what class of property is the subject is, residential, commercial, industrial, brownfield, conservation use. All of these are classes of property, and they may have a different definition of value. Neighborhood is a unique term to mass appraisal. It doesn't mean subdivision. So you can have several neighborhoods in one subdivision, or several subdivisions in one neighborhood. Okay, so neighborhood are similar properties that are similarly situated and which are comparable to one another. Schedules, those are the tables and equations and the big math model that's developed within the appraisal software to arrive at value, and which can be used to test those values for measurements of uniformity and bias and level of assessment. In Georgia, we have the WinGap software, and that software was developed many years ago. Grant, in what year? 90s, maybe? WinGap? 88, 89. The WinGap software was first developed through a grant from the Tennessee Valley Authority. And the code section does allow the Revenue Department to support this software for the counties, but it's owned by the counties. It's the co-op. The counties own, the owner counties own the software, and the Georgia Department of Revenue daily provides online and on-site technical support. For the fee of, which is really the best part to the counties, $2,000 the first year you sign up to be a WinGap member. That's what it costs you to be on WinGap, and then each year after that, $1,500. So I hear that they're thinking about doing an increase, but I'm sure it won't be out of anybody's price line. But it's a very valuable tool to the Revenue Department because we have a lot of input in the way that it's written, and we can ensure the software is written. We can ensure that it's APM compliant, Appraisal Procedure Manual compliant. In addition, when laws change or new classes of property are voted in by citizens, we can immediately react and create the software, the new class codes, or the forms that need to be utilized by the county, and then just sweepingly update WinGap in every county. So it's really a very useful tool. There are about 144 counties that use WinGap. The others use good software as well. It's just not WinGap, but the others are also very good software. But this is a great tool for the Revenue Department and for the counties as well. One of the things that the Revenue Department is responsible for is the transfer tax. The form, the PT-61, is a DOR form, although it's administered by the clerks of Superior Court, and it's an online transaction now. I remember back in the olden days, we used to have to send an appraiser to the county deed records, and they'd have to kind of fight with the deed researchers to get into the book that had the latest, greatest sales. But now everything is electronic, and we provide sales data to the counties weekly. We compile that for them, put it up on the WinGap site, and they can download that directly into the appraisal system and then start matching it up and qualifying the sales. About 400,000 sales a year, a little over, PT-61's filed. So what does WinGap look like? These are just a couple screenshots. Again, we can download those PT-61s directly from the WinGap website down into the appraisal system, updating ownership information, and the assessor is accumulating lots of information about the property, tracking all the sales historically that have happened regarding the property back through the beginning of time, and then general information about the description of, you know, the acreage and the topography. And we have yes.
The last slide there, under property information, it says it has some LL, LD, GMD, and then legal and neighborhood. Neighborhood, is that the same terminology that you were telling us before? So that's the definitional term of neighborhood.
Right. It also has subdivision there, so you might enter subdivision as being one thing, but neighborhood could be several subdivisions that are similar to that. And neighborhood is very important because that's how that CAMA system is going to move value. Is oftentimes by neighborhood, not just the base value rates that are built into the schedule, but they can also move value by adding an influence factor for a neighborhood. If neighborhood A sells for 10% more than B, neighborhood A might have a 1.1 factor applied to it, and it would move up all of the values within that area. So it's very important for the assessor to accurately assign the neighborhood code.
Who, Judge O'Neill's asked who delineates the neighborhoods.
The assessor. The appraisers recommend that to the assessors. And when we're doing a review of a county, that's one thing that we would look at. How many neighborhoods have you got? And, you know, every market is local, so while some counties may not need a lot of different neighborhoods, they're very rural, others might need a lot. Um,
Possibly, a neighborhood is really, it can be as small as a street. And I know, like, take Barnesville, Georgia, there's a street called Thomaston Street. There's a lot of historic homes on that street. That's one neighborhood. So, or it could be as large as the north end of the county. It just depends on what the market shows when they run their studies and checks the market on the sales. Correct.
But if the traffic was bad and that was a negative influence to the property, you could account for that in other areas of the CAMA system. Not necessarily a neighborhood, yeah.
And your questions that you're asking are really good questions, and those are questions that I think members of the public are going to have too. So when you have them, let me know so I can put you on air. And since this is being recorded and broadcast, we can get those questions out there for the public.
Okay, and so there's several different land screens. This is an example of urban land valuation, but there would also be rural land valuation, different methodologies in valuing land, and so the CAMA system is going to account for the different types. This example is just basically a subdivision lot, so this would be the land screen that might go with that. Then example of the residential improvement screen, their assessors are going to go out there and measure the structure and evaluate its quality and condition and the amount of heated square feet and the amount of wood deck and basement. And they're going to enter that data, which is kind of the factual data on that assessment, into that record. But there are influence factors about the structure that the assessor can input as well. So appraisal is an opinion, so there's going to be factual parts of the appraisal and then opinion parts of the appraisal.
You had mentioned earlier that there was a definition a term called schedule. And you said that those were factors that dealt with the details of the home construction. And could you elaborate on that? Is that shown in one of these slides?
I don't have the base schedules shown in the slide, but behind this data that's being captured is a valuation table. And it's going to have the benchmark value for heated square feet and the base value, the average value for wood deck. And then it's going to have multipliers that would be applied if it was above average construction or below average construction, or of a very large size versus a smaller home, or brick versus frame. So it's going to account for beginning with a benchmark. They're going to build the base value of something and then build out from there how the value changes. And it's basically, the schedule is a large mathematical model that should work for mass appraisal purposes to arrive at a basic valuation of the property, but which can be tweaked if there's specific circumstances about the subject property.
How often are the schedules updated?
The schedules can be updated every year if the assessor feels the need to do that, or that's going to be a determination of the Board of Assessors. The Department of Revenue does a review of the county's assessment levels at least once every 3 years. The Department of Audit does a sales ratio study every year. And so the determination of how often they update the schedules is entirely on the assessor. In the period, but yes.
The house schedule, whenever you're
Right,
building.
could you pull that mic around a little bit?
Oh, sure.
There we are.
The house. Let me scoot over here. The base house schedule that's built in a CAMA system is for a typical house that's like a cookie cutter, average, typical run-of-the-mill house that's built, annually, and it's in a typical location. and they have to find the cost and what that market is for that type of house. And then from there, they can add neighborhoods for where you got better locations, and then you got the land records where you appraise the land based on differences between lands in different areas or different types of land. Like you got golf course areas, you could have a lot on a tee box and a lot on the fairway, or a lot on the green where it's real nice and pretty. And that view and the way that lot is situated would have different factor adjustments.
The assessor is going to consider the market, the income, and the cost approach to value. They're also going to consider those when they're testing and calibrating the schedules, and when they're making determinations about making individual property-specific adjustments to those values. There's also an improvement screen, so we're going to value the land separately from the building and then add those together. That's actually required in the law that we do a separate value of land and building, but the combined value can be no more than the fair market value of the property. And then, you know, we're going to add for pools and barns and things that are valuable to buyers and sellers. So the result is the report of what the value is, and that can be a notice of assessment, which I have not given you an example of here, but this is an example of a property record card, which basically gives the reader the physical characteristics of the property and the resulting fair market value for that particular year. It's a little hard to read on this, but the differences between single property appraisal and mass appraisal, I kind of wanted to show a side by side. Single property appraisal is a direct comparison of to the subject property using several comps, and you're adjusting those comparable property sales prices to make it similar to the subject property to come up with a value conclusion of the subject property. And you're also considering the income approach and the market approach. The accuracy on the single property appraisal is more often than not choosing the right comps and making the right adjustments to the comps to make them like the subject. In mass appraisal, the three approaches to value are considered when they're building that valuation table and when they're calibrating that table and when they're applying specific influence factors to a property. The trick in mass appraisal is being able to have the technical competency to build that schedule, which is quite a large math model and pretty complex. So building that would be the difficult part for the assessor.
Thank you very much. Is there any requirement in the law that in terms of the single property appraisal that the homeowner knows which properties were used for those comps?
There is, in the appeal process, there's a provision that says the assessor should provide the taxpayer with comparable properties. But remember, this is mass appraisal, and the assessor really didn't go out and get three comps and adjust them to make them like the subject. That's not really what they did, but the law does require that they do provide comps to the taxpayer.
And does it say at what point?
Once the notice of assessment goes out, the taxpayer can make a written request for all the information that went into that assessment, and I believe at that point the assessor could provide the comps or at the Board of Equalization hearing. Oh, that's okay. I'm really at the end of my part here.
Okay. Are you familiar with something called a Marshall and Swift manual?
That is a valuation guide, a cost manual that is widely recognized and widely used. And I would say that WinGap patterns that very well.
And also, they deal with depreciation, and
Yes.
that's sort of an art form in accounting as well as evaluation, I'm sure. And as that weighs against appreciation as far as residential values may be impacted by all the other modifiers that you were talking about. Is there tried and true depreciation ratios and that you can count on year to year, or is that modified by market circumstance? I mean, are we remaking this wheel every year, or are we continuing sort of incremental valuations? That's where I kind of lose contact with the methodology, and we get into the opinion phase as opposed to the factual phase.
Right.
And also, that brings to mind, we're talking about hurricanes here. Is there a difference between restoration cost, as it might be revealed in these manuals that we're talking about, as opposed to real property on the non-land side? Are all those modifiers, or is that something that the Revenue Department teaches the assessors to deal with all those?
We do teach the difference between reproduction and replacement cost, and actually Grant teaches that cost approach class. So at the beginning of your question, you asked about the depreciation, and an assessor should update their depreciation schedule. It's part of the basic valuation schedule. They should update that when they update their building and land schedules. Sometimes they might go many years without updating the base valuations in that CAMA system, and in that case, some newer homes might miss a little bit of depreciation they may need. So it's probably wise to update the entire schedule as often as possible, rather than delaying that too much and maybe causing staff to have to make individual changes to properties. Better to let the CAMA system do most of the heavy lifting. And then the second part of your questions, I know when I was in Fayette, and the GMA would, and our emergency management people would ask us to come out with them after floods and stuff, so that we could kind of do a reverse of, okay, we know what was there, what's gone now, and then give us a value quickly of what doesn't exist anymore, because the assessor is compiling all this information. They know what was there, and they have to determine quickly what's gone and what is the value of what is gone. So was that kind of where you were going with that reproduction? Yeah. But yeah, many, I don't know, there's a lot of assessors here, but I would imagine many work with their emergency management on a crisis like that. So the last slide that I'm going to just kind of ask you to look at is the Assessor Timeline. It starts with the assessment day, receiving returns. It's pretty complicated, and they have a lot to do, and they're usually juggling 3 years at a time, last year, this year, and next year. And so lots of work in the assessment office, and lots of different types of properties are constantly valuing, and the assessor doesn't really get the luxury of turning down an appraisal job. They just, if it's in their county, they've got to figure out what the value of that should be, and I think that's all I have for my presentation.
Thank you, Ms. Mills. Other questions from Ms. Mills? Those are good questions. If I was understanding you correctly, Ms. Mills, is that the schedule would include the concepts of depreciation versus appreciation, would include that data, would include as much detail as the value of a deck. And that was what I was understanding from Grant earlier, that was the case. So the schedule is a broad term that includes all the background data from which the baseline of value is built. And then when you get to one of those particular screens on the Canvas system, you can actually adjust and choose a different grade, if you will, for valuation. So a higher level, a pool I saw a pool with gunite versus a vinyl. And so you can choose and adjust that until you have a baseline, and that's all part of what we call the schedule, which is the backbone of the system. Okay. Ms. Baskin, you have a question?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Am I on? Okay, I have a question. Thank you for your presentation. We've heard that real property needs to be assessed between, is it 90% and 110% of fair market value? So where in the process does that check come in for the assessor? And a related question is the difference between a jurisdiction and a neighborhood. Because when you're talking about equalization, the value of properties within a jurisdiction has to be equalized. So for counties, there are 159 counties, is the jurisdiction the county, or is it something smaller? And if it's something smaller, is it neighborhood or something different?
So the assessor is going to be constantly calibrating their values and paying attention to that 90 to 110, which is in assessment world 36 to 44. 40 is the level of assessment in Georgia, and that's what they're looking for. But you can't get everyone at 40, but you want to be within 10% of that fair market value. So whether they're valuing subdivision lots or they're valuing improved properties or commercial properties or anything, they're pushing constantly for the 40%. They should be running ratio studies on their work constantly, daily, as they're making changes to values to determine that they're always pushing for that 40%. The jurisdiction can be a city jurisdiction that might cross several counties, and in that case the assessors have to collaborate and make sure that they each have good fair market values within their areas. But I suppose generally you would think of a jurisdiction as being either a city or a school system or a county, but it can cross county lines.
Okay, thank you.
Following up on that, you had said that the assessor should be running ratio studies with frequency daily, I think is what the terminology you used. Does the CAMA system, does it do that? Is that part of the program system that it can run these ratio studies and then and provide an update or a print off as to how the ratios are working out?
Yes, by neighborhood, by subdivision, by all one-story brick homes, by whatever way they want to look at a sales ratio study. They can look at it for older homes, newer homes, however they want to do it. They're going to constantly be tweaking and calibrating to make sure everybody, any direction you look at is going to be at that proper level.
And the check on that is, you mentioned something called the sales ratio study. Could you just explain what that is, and then correlate that back to the sales ratio study you're talking about through the CAMA system?
So you have these two oversight agencies. It's the Georgia Department of Revenue, and we have that direct oversight over ad valorem taxation. We approve the digest. We issue penalties if the digest are not proper in their levels of assessment. And then you have the Georgia Department of Audits and Accounts, who's creating this equalized digest for school funding, and then for two other reasons, so that the Revenue Department can properly propose an equalized ratio for public utility assessment, and then so we can measure the quality in the county's tax digest. And so that's an overall sales ratio study. The county should not wait for the overall ratio study. They should already know what this ratio is before they get our study. They're going to be doing that very same thing in small areas in different types of property. They're going to constantly be doing that throughout their appraisal process.
What is there a statutory or regulatory requirement that there's a periodic ratio check done by the assessors? And by periodic, I mean more frequently than 1 year or even probably a month.
I believe in regs, they have to perform sales ratio studies and provide that to the Board of Assessors before they approve the digest. I think that might be a duty of a chief appraiser.
To tell them to do that, yes.
Yes. I'm not sure if it's statutory or if it's in the reg, but...
normally most counties will keep their Board of Assessors involved in what's going on, so they'll bring them periodic studies to them.
But
to
the
show-
code basically requires the appraisers to do all this work and then give that to the Board of Assessors at a point in time with a sales ratio study, and then the board approves that, and then they send notices. That's kind of the way the code looks, but in reality, they have to constantly be bringing information to the Board of Assessors throughout the year. It wouldn't work if you just did it once.
Judge, you asked how often. It doesn't specify what frequency. When you're saying penalties, and so the Department of Audits is looking at, and you said an overall study, ratio study, that's really going back to Representative Baskin's question of the jurisdiction. That's just for the county itself as a whole, is that correct?
Right, right.
And that's done on an annual basis, that the Department of Audits is going back to determine whether or not the ratio of the sales within the assessed properties that's presented by the assessor's office to DOR and then to the Department of Audits falls within that percentage that you mentioned earlier, that 110 to 90% window, or conversely, as it applies to the percentage of assessed values, 36% to 44%. Is that correct?
That's right, right. Mm-hmm.
And then you had mentioned the penalties. What penalties from DOR, and how, and when would they be applied, in what context?
DOR reviews county tax digests on a 3-year cycle, and if a county were to fail in one cycle for, say, uniformity or lack of or bias in the assessment, then we would conditionally approve that digest and give them until the next digest review cycle another 3 years to correct that deficiency. And if that deficiency still exists in the second, third year review, then we charge a $5 per parcel penalty.
Is that $5 per parcel that was in error, or $5 per parcel for the entire
The entire
county?
digest.
And you said that essentially they have it's a 3-year cycle, so they initially have a warning in the first 3 years. Here's the problem, and and it's only if that same exact problem arises again in the next 3-year cycle in which
Right.
the penalty can be assessed.
Right. If they had a different problem, then it just starts the 3 years over again. So if they had a level of assessment property problem in 1 year, and then the third year review, it was a uniformity problem, that would just be 2 conditional approvals and no penalty.
How does this play out? And you'll jump in now. So, how does we have, and this may be a question more for Legislative Counsel and Blake, how is it that we go into a classification process in looking at residential versus commercial, or residential, commercial, industrial, multifamily versus maybe single family? Because it seems like we do get into sub-classifications, if you will. So we have the concept of real property, and the Constitution requires that we assess that based upon a fair market value and uniform across the board within that property. But yet, assessors do classify real property into subclasses, if you will.
The code does require classification of the properties, and then we expound on that in the regulations. So there's specific definitions of what is residential, what is commercial, what is industrial, and they are specific classifications.
And that's necessary in order to perform a mass appraisal, because you have to delineate those different schedules for that type of real property.
Yes, there are different schedules for the different classes of property, and there's different levels of compliance. That's probably a bad term, but an example would be uniformity ceiling in commercial would be 20 for coefficient of dispersion, or the measurement of uniformity, while for commercial or industrial, but it would be 15 for residential. And those are IAAO standards, that it's just a little bit more difficult to get those commercials, right in line, so that they have a little bit of a bigger leeway.
Judge, you have a question? Mm-hmm.
I admit I'm in 101 still, but in terms of the timetable of the approval of the digest, if the Department of Revenue approves the digest, then it goes to the Department of Audit?
No, what happens is the county assessor will forward their assessments to the tax commissioner. The tax commissioner is going to compile that digest and submit it to the Revenue Department by September 1st. And we immediately forward that. If we issue an order authorizing collection on that digest, we immediately forward that to Department of Audits, and they begin their sales ratio study on that. It takes them several months to do that, and they'll report in the following June what that sales ratio study indicates. So they've already built, the county's already billed on it and collected on that digest before we really know whether or not it's approved or conditionally approved. Yes.
Okay. So counties that have been, whose digests have not been approved, do you then ask for an annual review rather than a 3-year review? So if somebody's consistently delinquent, I mean, do they then provide do you do an annual review to see how progress is being made?
Now, Department of Audits is going to do an annual sales ratio study because their primary focus is getting that equalized digest for state school funding. So we're going to know every year what the sales ratio study looks like, and so will the county. But as far as the digest review procedures or the way in which the department acts, we've got a 3-year review cycle.
So they're they're separate
Yes.
operations. I get it.
So, following up on that, to what extent does a Board of Education have any say in this process?
The Board of Education or the county governing authority can appeal the Department of Audit's sales ratio study if they feel that it doesn't properly reflect the true ratio in the county.
But that's an appeal of the State Department of Audit's determination. That's not what oversight, what say, if you will, what voice does the Board of Education or the Board of Commissioners have in the assessment process so as to minimize the impact or to try to correct a problem before it gets to the Department of Audits and becomes an issue?
I don't know that the Board of Education has much impact, but the Board of Commissioners could, well, of course, they appoint the members of the Board of Assessors, so they would want to appoint people that were good at what they do. And they can also request the department to do a performance review if they were worried that the processes in the assessment office were not proper, and we could do that.
Yes.
One more question. So the Board of Assessors of the county, do you do, or does the department do any competency evaluations of the Board of Assessors?
We do training. We train the Board of Assessors. They have to successfully complete coursework. We do, the 3rd-year review, but we don't have any input into who is appointed to the Board of Assessors. We just train them.
But there's no procedure for you to sanction the county for having incompetent assessors on the board.
No, I don't think so, no.
So, following up on what Ms. Gardner is talking about, if I'm understanding correctly, the Department of Revenue's oversight of the local assessors is limited to a 3-year review on a 3-year cycle relative to bias in the assessment or uniformity in that assessment. Is there anything else that the department has in terms of a oversight?
Well, what we do is use the other tools that we have, which is WinGap is a great compliance tool because 144 counties are using it, and we have a lot of input into the way it works. And we also do the training. And we have the ability to write regulations to require assessors to get and appraisers to get certain training and take certain training courses. So we have that ability. So training and the software that they use and our 3-year digest review cycle and performance reviews if requested.
in theory, and then the follow-up question will be in reality, but in theory, you could have a board of assessors that generates an assessment over a course of 3 years, and then when that is tested by the department on a 3-year basis, it could be found that there are deficiencies within that assessment. The assessment, you would issue a notice, and then presumably those would be corrected over the next 3-year cycle, and before you would detect it again. Is that so? It could be you could have a 6-year problem before you would see it again to actually determine any penalties that would go in place.
And we could see it because, again, audits does their sales ratio every year, and we're
Okay.
going to input that every year, but we can only do anything about it once every 3 years.
Okay. Okay. So then the next question is, okay, are there examples of where there have been detected a problem in those within the 3-year cycle, and the Department of Revenues has taken some action to notify the county assessor's office of that problem? I don't need names of counties. I just want to know if it occurs with any frequency.
We do, we have agents that are assigned to counties, and the agents are headquartered all over the state. And their job is to have, a relationship with that county and to assist them with wind gap, with other needs, questions that they might have. So in that area, we could say, hey, we noticed that your sales ratio study indicates you're really low. You might want to look at that, or how can we help you, that kind of thing.
How many, and you may not know this off the top of your head, but how many counties within the last, let's just say in the last 5 years, has the department put on notice of a deficiency relative to their digest?
I don't know that off the top of my head, but I would say as we were coming out of the economic downturn, there was a lot of uniformity issues that seemed to be really widespread. And so that's worked its way out, and now we see generally maybe 2 or 3 counties each year that are conditionally approved. That might be an understatement, but it's not a tremendous amount that are overwhelmingly. We're only looking at 53 counties each year, and maybe less than a dozen are conditionally approved. I'll say a dozen. And the 2 or 3 would be maybe potential penalties.
Commissioner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to elaborate a little further on what Ellen has said, and what you have keyed in upon, is that the department has the ability to review and issue findings, but the only action that we have as far as any kind of consequence to the Board of Assessors would be a failure in 2 digest review years for the same deficiency, and that would generate the ability to issue the $5 per parcel penalty. Other than that, we merely can observe, review, offer guidance, and offer suggestions for corrective action, but we do not have the ability to compel it.
There's also that new code section that's only been around a couple years, where if the county were to tax exempt property, we could do and they could lose some grants. We haven't done that yet.
Because of the 3-year cycle, and I understand the magnitude of all this on the department, and how overwhelming that must be. That being said, what you said was that the counties can bill and collect before there's really any evaluation of submitted digest and values to them within this 3-year cycle. In other words, retrospectively, and it's just because that's the way it has to be because of the volume. From the taxpayer's perspective, is there any oversight? I get it, you can fine a county $5 per parcel. That hurts the county, but and I know an aggrieved taxpayer who is out economically as a result of a deficiency in a digest, they have the right to appeal those values, and a lot of times, most of them don't. They don't want to take on City Hall. Say there's a correction that takes place as a result of your hard oversight work in this 3-year cycle, and you get the counties to begin to do it right. If there's a group of aggrieved taxpayers within that county or jurisdiction, if we're dealing with a specific jurisdiction, that didn't appeal, is there anything that puts them back where they should have been had this been done properly, or are they just out? I know you're looking at it from the state's perspective and DOR's perspective. Who's looking after the individual taxpayer out there?
There's a couple different ways to dispute your tax. One is 311, and if you didn't appeal, you just didn't, and you can't get back in. The other is through a refund statute, but that requires the taxpayer to find a factual error in the assessment. You don't get a refund off of an opinion. You can get a refund if they said it was 20 acres and it's only 2, or something like that. And in fact, there's a code put in a few years ago that says if the assessor discovers a factual error, it's up to them to notify the taxpayer and the tax commissioner that it exists when it's to the benefit of the taxpayer. So that's 303, 485303. But other than factual errors, when it's just an opinion issue, like assessor, you really got it wrong, and now I figured out that you weren't uniform. No, outside the appeal process, I don't think there's much help for that.
Okay, other questions? So if I understood you, Judge, you're asking, you have a $5 parcel penalty, but to what extent is that, let's say that a neighborhood is not uniform, and that neighborhood group has been shown to not be uniform, and it has occurred, and you all have detected it, and you've notified the county. To what extent is there some acknowledgement and credit against the future tax bills to account for that uniformity or that overassessment if it was, or frankly it could be an underassessment? So, and there's no mechanism for that.
No.
Other questions from members? All right. Thank you very much, Ellen. Appreciate you very much for providing that information. All right. We have a few other members that have been so kind to provide just some answers to questions. Mr. Ramsey, would you mind just providing a brief summary of the document that you've presented to the committee on behalf of ACCG? And this does go into some of the governance of boards of tax assessors, and we appreciate very much your time spent on that and your staff's time on that. So if you could just provide a summary of those points, and maybe there's some follow-up questions the committee members will have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you again this morning. As I understood, my directive from the chair last time was to come back with a little bit of information generally about property taxes and county governments, but also the structural issues involving the boards of assessors and the boards of equalization. Ms. Mills showed one of her slides talking about kind of the general spread of taxes statewide, but I can tell you from the local perspective, the numbers do run differently. For local governments, property tax accounts for right at 2/3 of their revenue stream, and then sales tax is about 1/4. And the rest is made up of things like hotel, motel tax, occupation tax. So this is clearly the single largest revenue source for counties and schools. And as between counties and schools, we all know it from our tax bill. Generally, the school millage rate is higher. School systems in the state get about 61% of the property tax pot, and counties about 39%. And I'm going with some DOR reports. The last one I saw did not include a city breakout, so I don't have city numbers. Mr. Wiggins from GMA may when he speaks to you later. So one of the reasons I point that out, not only is it a huge revenue source, Compared to the state's revenues are a little more diversified. Income taxes make up about 55% of your revenue. Sales taxes, again, about a quarter. But you have some revenue streams that locals do not. And constitutionally in the state, local governments cannot levy a new tax unless the General Assembly gives them that power. So we have what we have. And property tax obviously is the biggest one. I think the property tax system as it exists now basically dates to the 1850s, since we started taxing on value. And uniformity has been a big issue ever since, until, well, it's still obviously a constitutional issue. In the 1983 Constitution is when we started introducing categories that were exempt from uniformity, and there are quite a few of them on the books now, and another one proposed on the November ballot, as a matter of fact. So that's a little bit of the background. Obviously, again, from county government's perspective, from schools, from cities as well, this is obviously a huge issue. We've talked about, or you've heard Ms. Mills talk some about the what are the mechanisms for dealing with issues that may pop up. It appears that in the Board of Assessors structure, where we have a separate board that is determining values for taxation purposes, that structure was put in place in 1913. And I can't tell you exactly what the intention was in 1913, but I think generally we've thought of this as we need a structure for assessing property values that has some level of independence from the folks who are relying on the revenues that system generates. So whether that's the county commissioners, city council members, school board members, we're going to have a separate body that's going to be in charge of assessing values. And that's the Board of Assessors. And the way the law is structured now, the Board of Commissioners of the county is who appoints the members of that Board of Assessors. There's one Board of Assessors for each county in the state. The Board of Commissioners appoints 3 to 5 members, and for terms in office of between 3 and 6 years, and that's decided at the local government level. Interestingly, and I didn't know this until I started looking into it for purposes of this committee, state law does allow for the possibility of elected boards of assessors that can be decided at the county level. To my understanding, Lowndes County is the only county at present that has an elected board of assessors. Talking a little bit about how the idea is maybe to have some separation between boards of commissioners and boards of assessors, there are kind of limited steps that boards of commissioners can take when issues may pop up. You've heard from Ms. Mills talking about there are training requirements that are placed on boards of assessors. They have to be residents of the county, or at least actually within 6 months of being appointed, I think is when the residency kicks in. But they do have annual training they have to go through with the Department of Revenue to understand what their job is. Well, what happens if folks don't like or don't believe that they're doing their job in an appropriate way? There are several processes that are set out in state law that are options, again, tied to the idea that this is not going to be a willy-nilly process that's tied to any kind of political concern. So these boards of assessors, once appointed, can only be removed for cause. And cause is defined in a couple of ways, but one is to meet the minimum qualifications, such as maintaining your training requirements, but also failure to do their job, to properly assess properties within the jurisdiction. How do you figure that out? Well, so boards of commissioners have the ability to remove board members from the boards of assessors if they fail to perform their duties. That process involves having to go to Superior Court and ask a judge to give a hearing on that issue. I will say in my limited experience, I don't know how often that process is implemented, because again, the idea here is that the Board of Assessors and their staff are the ones that know how to properly assess properties, and the Board of Commissioners may not have the independent knowledge to know whether they're doing their job correctly. They can hire a consultant. That's one possibility. But another one Ms. Mills mentioned is performance review boards. So county boards of commissioners can request the Department of Revenue to appoint a performance review board, which is made up of 1 DOR staff member and 2 chief appraisers from other counties who will come in, determine whether this given Board of Assessors is doing its job correctly. Is it assessing property in the way that state law requires? The info I saw from Department of Revenue is since 2000, there have been 33 requests for performance review boards, and those performance review boards have come in and done that analysis and issued their reports. The report that comes from that performance review board can form the basis of the Board of Commissioners' decision to remove one or more members of that Board of Assessors. Again, as I mentioned before, it's the same idea of a hearing in Superior Court applies there as well. The Board of Assessors can get that hearing and challenge their removal. I believe that of those 33 Performance Review Board actions since 2000, some number of them have come back and said, the Performance Review Board has said, well, these Board of Assessors are doing their job correctly, that there's not an issue here. Several of them have found otherwise, and I think 6 times in that time period, county boards of commissioners have in fact removed one or more members of the Board of Assessors based on that Performance Review Board action. I can tell you just from personal experience, I know that at least two of those 6 have then resulted in protracted litigation between the county and members of the Board of Assessors who have been subject of that removal action. So that doesn't as with other court actions, it doesn't mean that once that action is taken to remove them, that's necessarily the end of the line. To one of Judge Neal's questions earlier about what can taxpayers do, there is a separate option that is out there, and frankly I don't know how often it's been used, that 100 freeholders, which are property owners within the county, can file a petition in Superior Court alleging that the Board of Assessors is not doing its job, it's not properly assessing property, and that proceeds as any other court action, with the Superior Court in that case actually being the final decision maker as to whether members should be removed or not. Unlike the other ones where it's the Board of Commissioners that is making that removal decision, the Superior Court judge on a petition for freeholders can say, you're correct, they're not doing their job, I'm going to remove them from office. So those are the structural mechanisms that exist as to removal of Board of Assessors. As I mentioned, I think it's all set up with the idea that this is not going to be something that can simply be done and people replaced on a whim, that there needs to be real reasons for that. And again, I know this is something that has been used, the Performance Review Board especially, has been used fairly frequently by county boards of commissioners to look into these issues. The other piece that I wrote about has to do with boards of equalization. And boards of equalization are the first step in most cases on appeals. If you don't think that the Board of Assessors has properly assessed your property value, they don't agree with your number, you can appeal to the Board of Equalization. The Board of Equalization also has to be folks who reside in that jurisdiction, in that county. There's one Board of Equalization for each county in the state. However, the larger the county, the more boards of equalization can be appointed. It's one for each 10,000 parcels within that county. And so as you can imagine, as we get into a county like Fulton, which has over 300,000 parcels, the last time I was aware of, they have a lot of boards of equalization out there to deal with appeals. Board members on boards of equalization also have to be trained using an annual training that the Department of Revenue provides based on the standards that they impose for those board members. Interestingly, the appointment process and removal process is different. I would say archaic, but not necessarily. That the members of boards of equalization are appointed and removed by the grand jury. Any given property owner within the county can apply to be a member of Board of Equalization. They apply to the Superior Court Clerk. The Superior Court Clerk forwards that info to the grand jury, and the grand jury is who selects the members of the Board of Equalization, or boards of equalization as the case may be. The grand jury is also the entity that has the power to remove members of the Board of Equalization. Anyone can file a complaint as to the Board of Equalization's performance of their jobs. That appeal is provided to the Superior Court clerk, who again forwards that to the grand jury, and the grand jury will investigate as to determine whether this board member or board members are properly doing their job. And if the grand jury so decides, they will actually remove the members of that Board of Equalization. Again, I think the idea here is, and that structure I think has been in place since 1972, as far as boards of equalization being in existence. I can't tell you about the grand jury genesis of that, but again, I think the idea is that we have a somewhat, and maybe more than somewhat, independent group that is looking at these value issues. It's not the elected county commissioners, it's not the school board members, it's not the city council members who rely on the revenue that's generated, who are making that decision. Mr. Chairman, that's it in a nutshell as to what I presented to the committee, but I'm happy to try to answer any other questions that any members may have.
All right. Any questions from members of the committee for Mr. Ramsey? Joel, does GMA, you want to add anything to that at all, to what Mr. Ramsey has said? Okay. And then once Joel has spoken from GMA, then what we'll do is we're going to take a brief recess, and then we'll have Grant come back and show you through the WinGap system, and I meant to go over that before we jump to the others. So we'll go back to WinGap and look through those and go through those pages, because I did want to show you that online. So Joel, if you'll come up, and if you have anything to present on behalf of Georgia Municipal Association.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, I appreciate you having us today. I did want to make a quick differentiation with the city's role in the property tax assessment process, which is limited. So I have here with me today Russ Madison. He's the finance director with the city of Decatur, who's one of our more involved cities as far as the process goes. So the city is not in charge of actual assessing property. We receive the assessments from the Board of Assessors, and at that point we have roughly a quarter of our cities that have some role, whether that be applying the homestead exemption for the city themselves or billing, or both. So as Mr. Ramsey mentioned earlier, about 2/3 of the county's revenues come from property tax. About 27% of the cities come from property tax. And you also typically see lower millage rates in cities. It's not always the case, but by and large it is. So if there aren't any other questions on the overall role, I'll turn it over to Mr. Madison to address what City of Decatur does.
Welcome, Mr. Madison.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everybody. I just want to give you a little 5-minute overview of the impact of assessments and appeals that the county does on our city operations. So, City of Decatur residents receive bills from two jurisdictions, City of Decatur and DeKalb County. And in our case, the much larger bill comes from the city to the taxpayer. We handle our own homestead exemptions. We do our own billing, collection, delinquent collections. If the assessments change or are updated, appeals settle, we issue a corrected or updated bill to the taxpayer. A lot of times they look to us, even though the assessments originate from the county, because ours is the larger of the two bills. We hear from them right away. We'd love to see them. They come in and let us know right off the bat if they believe there's a problem with their assessment. We kind of try to redirect them, but they do ask us questions, and it's, for us, it's 85% of the city's revenue comes from property tax, so a little bit more than what some of the other cities Joel has mentioned. And so we're very dependent on those values. Our budget makers are dependent on the numbers we're receiving from the county. So the county will give us periodic consolidated digest sheets throughout the year, and our budget makers are using those to forecast and make decisions about the budget. And our auditors are also relying on those numbers. The appeals that come, and we get, of course, the detailed digest once a year. And our really, they're always looking carefully at what's under appeal, but once taxpayers began to receive assessment notices every year, which is great. But you know, they do tend to appeal more. That went up, and our audit it changes what the auditors look at. They're always trying to reconcile the digest to what we actually build. And so there's always a lot of questions about which exact properties were under appeal and at what percentage a temporary billing value was used for that appeal. So I'm very grateful to the committee for including a city in this discussion, because even though we don't do the assessments, the downstream impacts are very significant to us and to our residents. We maintain a separate software system. We don't use WinGap. We don't use the system that DeKalb County uses. So we get files periodically from them of updated values. So it is not maybe as seamless as the taxpayer may expect. If a value is settled or updated, again, we're receiving periodic spreadsheets from the county, and we're grateful to the county for sending us the information. I think they do a great job. But I did want to just, let you know it is two different offices, and there can be some effect on how quickly we could turn around a refund to a taxpayer because of that. If they're due a refund from a settled value that was lower than the temporary value at which they were billed, or if it settles for higher, they may owe a residual amount, which I think there's still a lot of confusion out there among taxpayers as to how they can win their appeal but still owe money. But it's mathematical certainty that if their appeal settles for more than the temporary value that was used during the billing, they are going to owe more. But that's sometimes a bit of a lift. But in general, the process works well, but there may be some room for improvement. I appreciate the committee looking into it.
Thank you, Mr. Madison. Joel, thank you. All right. Any questions from members of the committee? All right, let's take a 10-minute recess, and then we'll come back and then we'll let Grant show us the WinGap and go into the details of that system so you can see the Canvas system we use. And then from there, we'll get into the final comments from those that have signed up and on the sheet here. Thank you. We'll be back at 11:33. through in computing and how you apply wind gap, and then what inputs are placed into the system, and the degree to which the system helps to create that uniformity of assessment within each jurisdiction. So with that, Mr. Hilton, I'll turn it over to you and let you walk us through a few of these systems.
Press this button. Okay. I'll start out with the schedules and just explain the residential, the commercial, and the accessories and things like that, just general typical things. We have a residential module, a commercial module, and a manufactured housing module, and then for any outbuildings like pools, barns, utility buildings, detached garages, things like that. To start the system off, there's what's called a preferences. And you'll see over here, these are what's called point-based costs. So that's the first step that the county would take, is they want to set their point cost at 100 or $1. Some counties use 100, some use $1. If you use $1, it's kind of more like a square foot method than using 100 point. And the reason the 100 was there is back years ago, back before 1975, the old basic appraisal system was a point cost system. And all that means is as you choose specifications about a house, it'll add points for it. And then, of course, behind the scenes, you assign those points. Well, in this case, this system is set up in this particular county as at $1. So anything I apply for like fireplaces, bathrooms, porches, decks, things like that, it'll kind of drive a per square foot method. So that's the first step they would have to do. The other thing, y'all were talking about depreciations and asking questions about depreciation. If I was in a county and I was doing a revaluation and I was going to change all my schedules, the internal base parts of the system, then I would come here and set my residential cost to either 1 year less the digest, because that was when the house was built, and then it would start depreciating from that point. And then as the house gets older, the depreciation tables move, and I'll show you how those work. So that would be their first step. And as you see, we have a depreciation base for each one of these years for residential, commercial, manufactured, housing, and accessories. And that's because sometimes the assessors may need to do a residential reappraisal, but not a commercial reappraisal. So you wouldn't want to change your base year to start depreciating if you hadn't updated your cost tables. But they should do this, I don't know, within a 3-year period. You want to look at your base schedules and make sure that they're up to what the market is showing. All right, when we talk about base schedules, the system has one part of a house that you want to look at and what style that house is. And I got some pictures here for an example. The system for residential is one set of tables for a specific base type house that the assessor chooses. And that's usually an average, typical run-of-the-mill house that's built in any county in the state. And you can see the difference in the styles of these houses. But they're all typical houses you would see today. So what the county would do is talk to a builder or go out and look at Marshall and Swift, but they can't use Marshall and Swift and key Swift tables into the system because there's a copyright infringement for Marshall and Swift, and they want a big fee for you to do that, and it's rather expensive. And they also have that copyright license that the assessors could be in big trouble if they just took the information and keyed it into their camera system for their location. So counties can't do that. So they have to rely on builders. They have to call several builders within the area that build houses of this nature, and that's where they would start setting their base rates for porches, decks, fireplaces, bathrooms, extra fixtures, whatever they had in the bathrooms. Today they're building houses with double sinks in the guest bath, so each fixture would be a price, and that would add as you answered the questions on the house. And then y'all talked about depreciation. Well, these are all houses that are similar, and here's one built back in 1920. And the only difference between the quality grade of this house is nothing. They're all built basically the same style. It's just the year that the house was originally constructed. So over time, a house will depreciate based on wear and tear or maintenance or lack of maintenance. So if the owner chooses not to maintain their house, of course, it's going to deteriorate very rapidly. And then as they decide that the plumbing fixtures need replacing and the countertops, then that's where the assessor comes in and assigns an effective age to bring that house back up to the maintenance as of a house close to what today's standards are. All right. From those base schedules, as the quality grade goes up, and you can see the design difference in this house, it has more cuts, it has dormers, it has longer windows, better doors. Then the quality grade would be raised for this house versus the base house that the schedules are built on. And here's an older house that is of similar style, and it would be depreciated differently than this house. So they're both good. That's what we teach in class, is to look at the house as it was constructed when it was built brand new, quality grade it based on what you see for design, overall architecture, and how good a quality of workmanship there was. And we have a 40-hour class on this about 4 times a year, so the assessors and appraisers get to go to that. And as you can see, now we're moving on up with a different design here. We're getting more frills. So that would be a good house there, as that one would be a very good quality. So there's a grade range that they can pick from and choose from. Most counties usually go within a 5-number increment, with 100 being an average. So this would be like a 145 or a 150 grade. So this is a lot better house than an average house like this one. So that's what quality grade means. And as you go up the spectrum, you can see here's an excellent quality house. You see how many more cuts in the roof and how much window work there is. If you went in this house, it would have all kind of granite countertops, crown molding around the top of the ceilings. It would have tray ceilings, hardwood floors probably throughout, and just excellent workmanship and extra fixtures like bathroom fixtures and stuff. And then, of course, there's always the high-dollar homes, and these are called extraordinary high-value homes. And these are the houses that would have a quality grade overall, but each house has its own unique difference based on the architecture design. And this is where it gets tough for the appraisers to make a judgment call on the quality grade. So you can tell how much difference those two houses are. All right, that's where the appraiser may use what's called a cost and design factor, or a CDU, cost and design factor. They would, maybe the neighborhood is a high dollar neighborhood. They may all have the same grade, but each one may have a different C and D factor. Now, they need to be consistent and figure out from the market how to do those C and D factors, but that's kind of how you change those base tables. All right, with that said, once we've set the point cost and we've set our depreciation year, then we can go to the tables themselves. And we go to the residential table, and the first thing is to assign a base area. What is the typical size house throughout the county? That's the majority of them, and they would set that as the base area. So houses that were smaller or larger would move periodically based on the cuts in the roof as far as the floor plan, and there's an algorithm in the system that generates that, and that's called a size shape adjustment. And it moves based on a 50 square foot movement, or that's something that the assessors and appraisers can decide at their office internally. Now, once you decide all that, you decide what is going to be my base cost for the shell of a house, not talking about the exterior wall. Not talking about garages, decks, porches. It's going to be the shell of the house plus typical internal interior construction. So it may be some hardwood, some vinyl tile, but that would be the base cost for that type structure. And that is determined based on what the county finds out from looking at their valuable sources for what construction costs. And then we have what's called an increment factor, and there's an increment factor and an increment base, or an increment factor low and an increment factor high, because when you set the base area for a structure that is the typical house, then you got houses that are smaller. And for a contractor to come out and build a smaller house, they may charge you a little more per square foot. Kind of like when you go to the grocery store and buy a box of Tide, you got the little box, then you got the big gigantic box. One is a price per ounce difference, isn't there? And that's just called economies of scales. Usually the market shows that based on the smaller homes being the starter homes, and then as people begin to get bigger families, they build bigger structures with nicer details and things like that. So that's kind of what that does. They have what's called heating and cooling. They'll charge extra for heating and cooling based on whatever heating and cooling type the house has. And you can see central heating and air is $5.58 a square foot in this county. Just central heat but no air would be $3.30. So they have the ability to change these based on what they can find out from the market or from builders or other sources. All right. The next thing is you have like little finished areas over garages. You can price those as an attic type, and it can be finished, unfinished, full, half, so forth like that. And then if they come in and build it out like the bottom floor of the house, then you can add for the finish. Or it could be a rec room. So that depends on whatever they find when they're reviewing properties. And then there's basements that they would add value to. If a house had a basement, then you would price the basement as a concrete poured walls or concrete block. And then whether it has finish, you could add for the finish. And that would be an additional adjustment in value. And then usually ceilings and interior fixtures of the house, interior finish of the house, usually they don't change that. That's usually kind of moved to the quality grade of the house. And you'll know by your builders who's building granite countertops and who's putting in Formica type, old style, cheap countertops and so forth. Exterior wall, though, the appraiser would make a difference between the different types of exterior wall siding. And, of course, brick would probably be more than wood. When they build their base cost, usually wood, there's probably more wood houses or vinyl houses in the county, in the jurisdiction, and they would set that cost multiplier at 1. And that would mean that the base cost would take care of that exterior wall. And then there's the different types of fireplaces or any other miscellaneous item that a house may entail that would need to be added for value, like an elevator. The basement sometimes doesn't get hit with heated and cooling. Sometimes they'll heat and cool the basement, so that's something somebody would add. And then this is just open-ended for whatever else is extra to the house. And then there's the floor construction. Used to a slab house built on an overall slab was a cheaper build than one that was on a wood joist. And now with the price of concrete, they may be close to the same price because concrete went up in price. So this is something that the appraisers has to really go in detail and find this information out from some source. Floor finish is kind of in the interior. You wouldn't adjust for that. Usually the quality grade may let you move that a little 5 or 10 points based on how they've really tricked out the floor finish. Is it better hardwood floors than typical? Is it laminate? Things like that. However, they do have the ability to, they could cost out each one of these items. Foundation, usually that's not priced, but some counties do it. Take, for instance, up in the mountain areas, they have to build a more sturdier foundation on a mountain, so they may come in and add more money for different types of foundation here as opposed to just a floor construction. And then we get to interior wall. Some counties, rather than doing a C&D, may put something called sheetrock custom, and that takes care of all that extra crown molding that may be in a structure versus one that's just typical. And then observed condition is, it ranges from fair to excellent, and this drives the depreciation table. So when they choose the condition of the house, it'll move in the matrix where the depreciation factors are. And I'll show you all that in a little bit. Occupancy. Occupancy could relate to the style of the house. Some counties find that condominiums may need their own pricing schedule, so they can adjust all the base schedule for a condominium. Historical market homes, they may be more prevalent and people are desire those more. They could make an adjustment here for that. I've seen some actually call it a ranch, a condo, Victorian. If they could do a market study, they could actually adjust based on the style of the house other than just the grade. So that's open-ended too for the counties. Let's see. Plumbing. Normally a standard complement is what every house usually has to have for code. And that would be a 3-fixture bath, a water heater, and the kitchen sink. So they would do a lump sum for that, those type fixtures. And then anything they count extra in the house would get a price per fixture based on what it is to install that fixture and labor plus the typical fixture itself. And in some counties have found that a hip roof house, which looks like a cap, is more valuable than a gable roof. So they could come in and make an adjustment for that if they found the market adjusted where you got a hip roof is more valuable than a gable roof house.
When you're saying, Mr. Hilton, when you're saying more valuable, I mean, we're talking about the construction value of the home. And
that's correct.
And there are two other ways to assess the value of a piece of property, right? There's an income approach, there's a cost approach, which we're talking about cost here.
We're talking about cost at this point, yes. But now, y'all remember I showed y'all that point cost?
Mm-hmm.
That's where you adjust those cost tables for market.
Okay, and then we get into market sales, so you're looking at similar properties that have sold in the marketplace.
Correct.
Right.
Now, once you set your point cost, that is the cost tables times the point cost, which gives you the market analysis for a typical home in a typical location. That's the base specifications for your camera system. And then we'll get into neighborhoods in a minute, and that's where you have different locations, and they drive value. All right. Story height, this does not assign any value. This is just a base description for the house that prints on the property record card. And that's what the overall house may appear to be. If it's more 2-story than one, they would call it a 2-story house. And here is where you have some driving influences and factors. This is where you actually, the polygon you draw for the bottom floor or top floor of a house, this is where it actually goes to that base cost and applies a cost factor adjustment or an area factor adjustment. Some counties choose to draw each floor. Then in that case, a 2-story house would have a 1, and then they would draw two 2-story sections sitting on top of one another. In this one, a 2-story house has a 1.9 cost factor and a 2 for the area factor. So they just draw one polygon and it multiplies it times 2. So that's how they set that up. And then, of course, you got your carports, your decks, your porches, and they carry their own square footage price. All right, and that's basically all there is to the base specifications of a residential structure. But it takes a lot of detail and work to get all these figures to go into the system. Now, if Marshall Swift was kind enough to not charge us, they could do this in quick fashion, and then they could really get what they need to be doing. But that's too much expense. Now, what a lot of counties do is once they get their base house set in the system, they'll go work one manually with the Marshall Swift manual that they have, or there's an online Swift estimator, and they can compare what Marshall Swift says to what their system is showing. And then they could tweak the point cost. So, or tweak, maybe they're overpricing bathrooms, but they can't just take Marshall Swift and key those figures in. And then we'll jump to commercials real quick, and this is all usually based on use types. And of course you see all the different types of commercial buildings. We got armories, arenas, banquet halls, bank central office, bank branch, bars and taverns, bed and breakfast homes or inns, churches, schools, industrial buildings, all that is in this commercial industrial module. And it's based on a base cost for the use type, just like the residential are, except they find this information out from the builders that build those types of commercial buildings in the office or in the jurisdiction. Each commercial has a different framing type, and typically a masonry load bearing is the typical. So you see the factory is set at 1. And then if you get these buildings that are multi-stories that have steel and concrete, they have a higher frame type, so the base cost for that building is adjusted by that. And then you got your heavy structural steel, which is like these nice high-rise buildings you see out here in Atlanta. And then, of course, you got your wood steel combustibles, which is the brick veneers or the Zaxby's and things like that. And then you got your prefabricated structural steel buildings that are just special metal buildings like Family Dollar, Dollar General, things like that. And also associated with that is the life of a typical building for that framing type of that construction. And that generates which way it uses the depreciation tables for commercial based on the life of the building. And then they could put all the major costs of the interior of the building inside this base cost, and then they got a chance to go change it based on each individual building. But most of the time, buildings sell based on their use type, and most of them are built and have the same interior functionality. So some counties don't get into what's called a segregated costing method. But the system will do that. They could price the foundation, the wiring, the plumbing. They could do everything about a building. The sprinklers, which they do anyway, the type of ceiling, the type of carpet, the type of flooring. I mean, it could go on and on and on. And then next to that, we have schedules for manufactured housing. And
Mr. Without going,
okay.
If you could just touch on them quickly, because it's in the lunch hour,
Okay.
so I'll try to hit those quickly. In terms of the cost analysis, I think we're getting the point here about that you build that base schedule
That's right.
for each of the different types. So you have residential, commercial, the manufactured housing. You're going to take that from market-driven information. You're going to compare that within the jurisdiction you're in.
Correct.
And you may use the SWIFT analysis to also verify.
Correct.
And I think it would be helpful to move into how that factors into the market, and then the income approaches, so that those get factored into your neighborhood systems and how that location plays into it.
Okay. Usually, residential doesn't sell on the income approach unless you've got like duplexes or you have renters. And usually they do build a model for residential using income approach, but usually the market of sales is a better approach.
Okay.
So there is an income approach, and let's see if I can find it. And I don't have any built in this particular thing. This is my Rabun County public utility file, so it's kind of raw. But within here, you can build all kind of models for different types of income producing properties, like warehouses, residential rentals, office complex, multi-story buildings, Section 8, Section 13.
Mm-hmm.
You can even break it down by frame type if you wanted to build your model that detailed.
Okay.
So some counties have just basic models, some really get into it, like Clark County. They have a lot of different multi-use type buildings, so they have a lot of models built.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the income approach. And then, of course, the outbuilding table, that's nothing really to worry about. That's just, it's got that where you can build a swimming pool and price it by whatever the price per square foot of a normal swimming pool is. You quality grade it and you depreciate it just like you do houses. Now, the accessories usually have a contributory value, because to the overall value of the parcel, what is a swimming pool worth? So they have to talk with realtors and brokers and find out what is that outbuilding actually contributing. Because if you try to price it by the actual cost, it probably wouldn't generate that if you sold the land and the house and the pool together. So they make adjustments with that.
I see on there you have a tab for sales reasons, and then neighborhoods, street directories.
Correct. One thing is the SB 346, it was passed where it was the most recent arm's length transaction shall be the value if it's less than the assessor's value.
Mm-hmm.
And this kind of drives that system and how it handles that. So you have to have good sales assessment reasons as to why that property sold. Was it a foreclosure? Was it a bank resale? So that's where the county determines all those and puts those in this sales reason code. Was it a affiliated party, brother to brother, daughter to sister, whatever? So that's what drives that. And that also allows them to run ratio analysis on the good sales versus the ones that shouldn't be, considered in deriving market. Okay. And you can see that arm's length sale thing there.
Mm-hmm.
That could be checked, and now the system knows how to, when they go to enter a property and they enter the sale will allocate everything to come up with that 1 year arm's length sale price based on these reasons. Okay, that's basically the schedules as far as value.
Now, we saw the PT 61 forms. To what extent does that information get loaded into WinGap?
There's what's called an add-ons tab, and the county goes out each week and downloads it. It downloads a file that we put together, and I say we, DOR. We get that information from the clerk's authority, and then that's divvied out to a website, and when they click this button, it automatically goes out and gets the PT61s for that week, and they download them to the system. So some counties come in, and once they do this, and they actually print the PT61s manually and then go work them manually, but the system also has a match process. And they can actually go in and take the sale, the PT61, and match it to the parcels in the file, and actually go through and do the transfer real quickly. Okay. Y'all talked about depreciation. There's a set of depreciation table for residential, commercial, accessories, non-pre-built homes because they don't move as much, or pre-built mobile homes that tend to move a lot. Just show you the residential table. It'll open up for me. This is based on quality grade ranges. So the theory here and appraisal theory in it per APM and all generally other accepted appraisal textbooks, the less quality the house is, the faster it will depreciate because of the workmanship and materials used. So they would build one that handles the low grade houses, and then they would build another table for the fair grade houses. So a fair grade range may be from 60 to 85, where we said 100 was a average house. The fair grade would be like from 60 to 85, and that's set by the county however they want to do it. But that's how most of them are set up. And then of course you have your 100 grade table, which is the average house, and usually an average house is somewhere between an 85 grade and a 110 grade. So that would, once you put the grade in on the house, it comes to this table based on the actual age. Now if the county has put a effective age on it, then it would use that, not the actual age. And that's because someone may have built a house in 1950, but they have remodeled it up to a point that it's like a 1980 house. So you'd put 1980 effective age, and then it would look at the base and the preferences and then deduct how many years that is, and that's where it gets the depreciation amount. And you can see average house, the system in this case is giving 1% off the first year, and as it gets 10 years old, it's giving 9%. So that's how that kind of works. Now there is also condition adjustment from excellent to poor. And a good example of this is if I had a 1950 house and I had made it like a 1985 house, well then to me that's good relative to its age. So I would use the good condition and that would move it to a different matrix. As opposed to one that's maybe being rented at college where it's being holes in the wall and things like that, then you may go fair instead of average. But usually every house is in average condition when it's first built. Now some counties don't like the effective age model, and they can say that a brand new house is excellent and it stays excellent in condition for so many years. Either method is okay as long as they can generate the market that bears that. Okay. What else would you like to see?
We talked about neighborhoods.
Okay. I got some Morgan County data, and they have an abundance of neighborhoods. So let's look at that. So what the county would do is they could do this in the interim years when they didn't want to change their overall point cost or their overall base individual parts of the house prices. They could actually run a market study using a sales ratio. And of course they want to verify that their information is correct in that area that they're running the sales ratio on. So let's say Blue Springs. For this particular year, the sales ratio may show that everything's okay, so they wouldn't adjust anything. But in this case, Appalachia Woods apparently needed an adjustment. So the market had went up 13% because Appalachia Woods may have some available houses for sale, and they're selling more than a typical house in another typical location of the same quality, same makeup. So the market is for location.
Mr. Chamberlain, this looks like that this particular county has broken theirs down based upon subdivision names.
They could, and that's all fine, well and good. It's just more to explain, but it's also just puts them in one market. But normally they'll have subdivisions that are alike. They may have a separate name, but they'll have the same 1.13 on them.
Okay.
So, because not every subdivision is going to have sales, but it may have the same amenities, the same quality of construction, and the same type makeup of houses.
So neighborhood can be made up of one subdivision or multiple subdivisions.
That's correct. And as long as they've got the market to back up
Who-
figure, that's what they need.
Who determines the makeup of a neighborhood?
That would be the chief appraiser, based on his appraisal staff's information that they come to him or her with. And then, of course, the assessors need to be told that there is a neighborhood study, and, you know, they have to approve these values before they send out notices.
Is it ever done, is it ever done independently by folks outside of the appraiser's office to do
No, not
no.
that I'm aware of, no. Because the chief appraiser is responsible for the staff, and the board of assessors is responsible for what the chief appraiser does, so. Oh, yes, 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 yes. Right.
So what Ms. Mills is saying is that the local boards of assessors can hire independent appraisers to go out and do these independent studies for them. Okay.
I misunderstood. I thought you might mean another department.
No,
So,
no,
okay.
just
Okay. All right. They can apply it to the rural land. There's a rural land module. There's also an urban land module, and then there's the house itself. Usually they'll bump the house and possibly the urban land, and unless they change in the land tables themselves. So they have that option too, and I can show you that pretty quick. And they can also apply it to the commercial building in that neighborhood or the accessories. But usually they'll do a study that drives how much percentage up or down. Because there is bad locations where the typical house is overappraised. I mean, is perfect, where the other houses that are in this bad location may need a break, and that's prevalent throughout the state too.
all right. Mr. Schultz, we have what I'd like to do is take the last 10 to 15 minutes of time here that before we break, and see if there are other individuals. Brian, could you grab the question sheet? Are there any members, any questions for Mr. Hilton on the details of the wind ship system? Okay. Just being sensitive to folks' time and schedules, I think if we have follow-up questions, we may delve into those in detail later on, but I think that gives everybody a really good sense of what the system is, how it operates, the inputs, the amount of subjectivity that can be allowed for based upon the appraiser's review of that particular parcel or multiple parcels. So I think that's been very helpful and very enlightening. So with that, if any questions from members of the committee? Okay. All right, well, we have a few more folks that would like to speak. Steve Swindell from GAAO is here. Steve, did you want to speak specifically on any issues that we had addressed with you before? I'd like to get that, and then then we have Jet Tony as well. So those are our only two folks that have signed up. And we'll go ahead with you, Steve. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I don't really have anything to speak about specifically. I just thought I'd make myself available to the committee. I did submit a white paper on behalf of our organization. Just a lot of it had been covered by Ellen and Grant this morning, and through Larry's presentation. So I just wanted to make sure that you all were aware, and we've got other members from all across the state here this morning just to answer any questions the committee might have from our organization, from the assessment side of things. The only real statement I came prepared to make was just a reminder to the board that we're also property taxpayers and citizens just like everybody else, and many times it's our job to say no. We find ourselves in that position, and it's not just no to random citizens, but we have to say no to our friends and our family and our church members and to the community leaders as well. I mean, that's just the nature of the job of the tax assessor is we've got to appraise this property in as fair a uniform way as we can, and if anybody comes in asking for anything other than what is a fair and reasonable assessment, then many times we have to say no to them. So that being said, I'd be willing to entertain any questions that the committee has for us.
Any questions for Steve? Okay. Thank you very much, Steve.
Thank you.
And then Mr. Jet Tony also had a short presentation he wanted to present to the committee. Mr. Tony, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Jet Tony, representing the Georgia Affordable Housing Coalition. Members of that coalition are the developers who create the Section 42 affordable housing that is built and maintained throughout the state. These properties are built with a combination of financing instruments, but most prevalent among those financing instruments is the state and federal low-income housing tax credit. The legislature has passed the state version of the federal credit in 2000. Those state credits began flowing through a competitive basis through the Department of Community Affairs. The original program, the federal program, was a Ronald Reagan era program where President Reagan saw the wisdom in allowing investors to be involved in the development of affordable housing. So one of the, once DCA awards or allows for the allocation of credits to investors, tax credits, income tax credits in these properties, the developers build the properties, but in trade for the tax credits, which are, again, are a financing instrument that creates capital to build the projects, those developers have to stay in the properties for a minimum of 15 years and basically through DCA rule stay in those properties for 30 years. And what occurs during that 30-year period, or the minimum 15, is that the rents are controlled. They're controlled by a factor of the area median income. These properties are multifamily, and they are developed for the purpose of providing housing for either senior citizens or for the workforce, lower income workforce. And what I wanted to do today is very briefly thank the assessors in the counties around the state who have recognized the income restrictions, the land use restrictions, the deed restrictions that are on these properties. And therefore, in recognizing that there is an income cap for many, many years on the properties, those assessors have promulgated appropriate assessments of the value of the property, and therefore the taxes are appropriate. However, in thanking those counties, the assessors in those counties, I recognize that there are assessors in some counties who do not recognize the rent control nature of those properties, and therefore have created or promulgated assessments that frankly at some point, if not appealed and reduced, are going to impact the financial viability of the properties. And when that happens, there will be an ugly situation. And if more assessors adopt that, what I would say is an inappropriate assessment of the properties, I think the entire statewide program could be in jeopardy. So again, my primary purpose is to thank the assessors who are looking at those unique characteristics of these properties as regards the rent control and the caps on those rents, and are therefore working with the state, working with DCA, working with DOR to assure that the program is viable and continues to work. And I would say to you that the program is clearly successful because it has generated over 100,000 residential units for seniors and working families or working individuals at the low-income range throughout the state. And many of those properties, if not most, are built where the local market would not otherwise support the construction and maintenance of these properties over a 30-year period. So, Mr. Chairman, just wanted to give a kudos to those assessors that are recognizing some of the factors which impact and burden these properties.
Any questions for Mr. Toning? All right, thank you, sir. All right, it's about 12:30. We've gone a long session, and I appreciate everybody's patience in that regard. And I suspect the next session on appeals will be probably equally as long. With that, what I would like to do is for each of the members of this committee to contemplate what you've heard today. And if you would, I would appreciate it if you could communicate back to Brian and I any aspects of the assessment process that you've heard today that raise questions in your minds. For example, for me, I think that the oversight relative to the assessment process, that 6-year window I have some trouble with. I mean, I frankly just think that's a long period of time to go without adjustment. And when I say that, what we're talking about is if you think of the local governments and the services that they have been asked to provide by their citizens in a representative democracy, if those assessments are prolonged or are frozen in time and they are not adjusted in keeping with the market, then what happens is there are local governments that are wed to, so if it's Decatur, for example, that is wed to an assessment that has now effectively been frozen in one shape or form and not adjusted with the market, then that means that the city of Decatur, whose tax base makes up, or property tax makes up 80% of its revenues, is restricted in what services the citizens of Decatur can request. And that would be applicable to any city. It would also be applicable to any county government. So in that sense, I have some questions about that, the duration in which something may not be corrected. And that would probably be the anomaly, not the rule. But I have some questions about that oversight, that review process. That's something that occurred to me today as we were discussing this that I'd like to examine a little more closely. So if you've heard something today that you think is an important issue that we need to examine or look at in terms of the assessment process, then please just write me an email or contact me in some way so that I can start to pull that information in, and should we need to revisit a particular aspect, we can do so. I thank everyone's time today, and if there are no questions or concerns or issues that you've seen today, I'll open that up to the floor from the members of the committee. If not, then I will stand adjourned until our next meeting, which is November 3rd, and we'll be covering the appeal process at that time. November 2nd? Let me check. No, that will remain fixed. We'll keep that fixed, and then what we'll do is we'll go to any subsequent meetings from the 3rd. We'll talk about having those during that session period, the 13th to the 16th.
10 o'clock, November 2nd.
Yeah, 10 o'clock, November 2nd. Thank you very much.